Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our esteemed group of panelists. First and foremost, Mr. Nipun Malhotra, social activist and co-founder, Nipman Foundation. Welcome, sir. Up next, we have Mr. Prashant Issar, co-founder, Squaremeal Foods Private Limited. Welcome, sir. Up next, Ms. Shazia Ilmi, social activist and spokesperson, Bhartiya Janata Party. And as our moderator, we have Ms. Maya Mirchandani, Senior Editor, Foreign Affairs, NDTV. Welcome, ma'am. Ma'am, over to you.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the sessions. They seem quite interesting from the program that we've been given. And I hope you've had a reasonable tea break, so you're energized for this session that we have coming up now. The topic that we're going to be talking about is, well, the way they framed it is, our world, their world, are we ready to hear other voices? And I think what they mean by these other voices is, well, simply put, people who are not like us. And they're not like us because they're physically not like us, their cognitive skills may not be like ours, their speech and hearing impaired in some cases, various factors that make them different. Nonetheless, does that mean that we're a society which encourages them to enter the mainstream? We include them in our growth charts as we see them? Or do we allow the kind of prejudice we've seen now for decades in independent India to continue? And I think a resounding answer to that would be no. I imagine it's time for us to change. We're well into the 21st century, and I think things need to change. You've been introduced to our panels briefly by the person who's making the announcements just now, but let me just tell you, Nipun Malhotra, as we know, has been a champion for the rights of people with disability, people who have been challenged in workspaces, in social spaces. He's been an outspoken advocate for their rights. Shazia Ilmi, as you know, is with the BJP, has also worked extensively in this sector, in the social sector, working for the rights of people who have different abilities. Prashant Issar is a restaurateur and a businessman. And I think his story, frankly, today is extremely inspiring. And I'm going to start by actually asking you, Prashant, because you are now running a restaurant called Mirchandani. Go visit it in Mumbai. Anybody who's in this room, go visit. And all right, somebody's gone, or we already have a hand up. Thank you. He hires his front staff with speech and hearing impairments. How does that work? Tell us a little bit about that, Prashant.
Thank you very much. Well, I've done restaurants all my life so far. And during that time, I realized that we actually do use sign language generally in a restaurant as well, asking for the bill or signaling for water or attention. So it was quite simple, really. When we decided all we had to do was train our workforce well, and we created a training program with modules like life sciences, job readiness, simple language, and hospitality skills. The good part was that our team was very receptive. They ask questions which are very basic, which normally people will not ask. I remember there was a barista who was training them on coffee. And at the end of his training session, I asked him, I said, so how was it? And he said, this was one of the most nerving sessions that I've had. And I said, why was that? Was it because of communication? He says, no, it wasn't. So he gave me an example. He said, when I tell people about coffee, I tell them, for an espresso, the crema on top defines the quality of the espresso. So they question, so people accept it. But in this case, they asked him why. You know, so their questions are so rudimentary that their clarity of thinking is so clear that they understand it in detail, and once they understand it, they don't make mistakes. So all we had to do was change verbal communication to visual, and it worked.
And you have guests and visitors who are quite happy with the service they get, clearly.
Yes, I mean, we had to plan some management interventions where people, when they come in, they are introduced to their server, and the menu, which is a communication tool, we designed it like a matrix. So all you need is 2 illustrations, one for every column and the second for every row. So you can order it. And it also says on top, if you don't want to use signs, just point at the dish. Staff are receptive enough, and they're very intuitive, and they'll get
Wonderful. Nipun, I want to actually come over to you now, because it's a very inspiring story from Prashant, and it also ties into an experience I think you had last year in a Delhi restaurant, which we carried on NDTV, and we interviewed you about it, when you said there were restaurants who were just not friendly towards your wheelchair. They didn't allow you access. They were embarrassed by your presence in their space. Tying in many issues that Prashant is talking about. One is, of course, opportunity, acceptance, and prejudice. I mean, you are a champion for the rights of people who are differently abled. What are the challenges you face, and how does an experience like Mirchandani perhaps fit into
No, I completely agree with you. I think attitudes are one of the biggest challenges that people with disabilities across this country face. You mentioned the incident last year, that's why I talk about it again. It was on 6 March last year that I was actually denied entry with this restaurant because they said that as a policy we don't allow the disabled inside, and I tweeted about it, and the issue kind of exploded with it becoming a breaking news on NDTV and all other news channels, etc. But what also happened because of that is that a lot of positive did come out of it also, because I remember contacting Zomato after that, and Zomato added a wheelchair access filter to restaurants, and what that filter does is that it not only identifies what restaurants are wheelchair accessible, but it also changes attitudes of restaurants towards people with disabilities. So attitudes are of course a big challenge, and I think attitudes are a challenge not just in restaurants but in public policy too. For example, the odd even is on again. The first stage of odd even, when it was starting in January, the Delhi government actually forgot to exempt people with disabilities from the odd even, despite the transport infrastructure that Delhi currently has. And I know at least 10 people with disabilities who wrote to the Delhi government but did not really get a positive response. Eventually, I actually had to take the High Court's intervention to exempt people with disabilities from odd even. So attitudes are a challenge both in the private sector and in the government. And what Prashant is doing is something wonderful. There are a lot of other companies also that have realized the business case for hiring people with disabilities. One of the inspiring stories that I often talk about is this courier company in Bombay that actually realized that when you're delivering a courier to somebody, the courier boy doesn't really need to communicate with somebody. So why not have all hearing impaired people? There's this it started by this Oxford graduate called Dhruv Thakra, who actually came back to India and started this company called Miracle Couriers, and it has the lowest attrition amongst all courier companies in the country. So I think there's a business case for hiring people with disabilities, and in terms of policy, yeah, attitudes definitely need to change.
Right, and Shazia, that brings me to you actually, because the question of policy is something which every government has kind of grappled with. We've had rights activists and advocates for the last 20-30 years who've been pushing for inclusion, for job opportunities, for skill development programs, for homes for people who cannot possibly be even included in some of these mainstream activities. So, prejudice is something Nipun has touched upon in the case of restaurants and things like that. Prashant is a very interesting example of how he's making his own little effort to change things, but it has to move beyond the novelty factor or the difference factor of one initiative or the outcry over one incident, for example, in Nipun's case, to just all of us being more accepting and treating people with different abilities and different skill sets as the norm.
Absolutely. Maya, I'll just give you some conservative figures. 28 million is what we're looking at. And this is probably much more than that, the number of persons with disabilities. Almost half of this population now is totally illiterate, has very little access. Even those who are literate are not employable in that sense. So when you look at even the National Action Plan on Skill Development, which has a very ambitious mission of providing going to at least 12 lakhs of people in the next 7 years, so to speak, I think a lot more needs to be done. But it's all-encompassing prejudice. And I'll tell you, one of my closest friends who passed away, Pradeep Purtet Singh, was consultant with Spastic Society, now called Adi. We did a show on disability and access, disability and infrastructure, disability and sexuality, disability and religion. And you'll be shocked whether it's your religious text, whether it's a social conditioning, whether it's your mass media, your media houses. There is such a huge bias. So the attitude is from extreme, either ridicule, complete ridicule, to sympathy and overt sympathy. Now we are looking at just empathy. We are looking at people with the attitude that they have different abilities, one, and they're also assets, that they are employable. So unless and until we move the whole thing from, oh, these people, we must take care of them, and there should be a separate, they have to be mainstreamed. We have to see them for who they are. Now, when it comes, we have the highest number of blind in the country. If you look at that, I mean, do we have enough centers? Look at our RWAs. So I think more than just a big broad policy and forcing and CSR now, the private sector, persons with disabilities is included, to do CSR for them as part of the scheme. But it has to be much bigger. Where is the intervention in mass media? Whereas, look at the films that are made, look at the way the visually disabled or challenged person is treated. So we have to change that. It has to be on different levels. And also it's very important for the block level, panchayat level. For RWAs, I mean, the attitude is that of complete, maybe lack of awareness, maybe social conditioning, but then we don't see them as equals, equally productive.
Right.
And with different abilities and different assets, and to build on those assets. So the only way you can mainstream is to make them employable.
Okay,
and that comes with, and this is what you're doing.
Right, Prashant, in fact, let me come back to you on that, because to make them employable also is a challenge in itself. To make any of us employable, frankly, is a challenge for all educators around the world, and hats off to them who do their job so well. But in this case, you need special educators. You need attention on different skills that you might be able to train in different people. In terms of prejudice, I think I want to come back to how in your restaurant, in that particular case, have you had any encounters with members, with guests who've come in, who've not been 100% comfortable, and how have you reacted as management with them?
Well, we haven't had any such interactions in the last 1 year. Everyone has been very, very accommodating, although our business does not promote that people look at us with sympathy. So behind the shirts of all of my staff, we've written, I know sign language, what's your superpower? So it is just to tell people that yes, they have certain abilities. We've hired them for their abilities and not their disability. So people understand. So it's been very supportive, really. I've not yet. However, when someone complains about service in a restaurant, so we take heed immediately. In all the other restaurants that I've worked with, I used to get really worried. In Mirchi and Mime, I feel happy when someone complains about service, because that means they're benchmarking us against all other restaurants. So that for me is a form of acceptance. Yeah. That great, well, you're doing it fantastic, but if you make a mistake, we'll point it out. So I think it's just that.
And Nipun, earlier when we were chatting before coming on to the panel, Prashant was making the case that the attrition rate for his employees is 10%, which is 60% lower than the industry standard.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that's a lesson for people as well. If you want your employees to stay on, treat them with respect primarily, which is what I think Prashant is doing. And, make sure that they don't feel themselves that they are an oddity, in which case you have this novelty factor that we were talking about earlier. But I think coming back to the issue of social attitude, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the government sector, all of us as individuals, we're looking at implementation of government policies, some yardsticks, some guidelines have to be laid down in order for that push to be given to include people into the mainstream. And you were talking about how basic United Nations guidelines are not being followed currently in the country either.
Yeah, in fact, India, the current law in motion is the Persons with Disability Act that came up in 1995 in the country. And India actually signed the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2007. And India was supposed to follow that up with another law that would have strengthened systems in India and mandated at least government infrastructure to become accessible. Today, even government buildings in India are not accessible. I don't know whether you've ever gone to Delhi Secretariat, but there's a huge staircase leading up inside. I actually went there. I was invited to give a report there, and the place I was invited to give a report to was itself not accessible. But the government can do a lot. I mean, building codes can be changed. Other than that, whenever there's any commercial enterprise in the private sector that's set up, it requires a completion certificate, and that completion certificate requires a fire NOC and a couple of other NOCs. So why not add an accessibility NOC too? And what that will do is that won't only help people with disabilities in India, but that will also help the elderly population. India is one of the fastest growing elderly population. Over 8% of India's population today, as per the census, is elderly. And even though the census says that 2.21% of India's population is disabled, WHO says 15% of the world's population is disabled. So I guess truth lies somewhere in the middle. So you're talking about 15 to 20% of this country's population for which life will be much easier. I had this friend of mine who recently had a fracture, and she actually texted me that now I know how difficult life is for you traveling around the city because I have a fracture. So temporary injuries keep coming up all the time too. So accessibility is something that is necessary. The government has started this Accessibility India campaign, which I guess Ms. Shazia Ilmi might speak a bit about. But the unfortunate thing is the Accessible India campaign only talks about making government buildings accessible. That anyway should be done. I think what is needed is to incentivize the private sector to make private buildings accessible.
Yeah.
Today, as per the CSR law, you can donate money to make a garden or a public building accessible, but you cannot really use your CSR funds to make your own infrastructure accessible. So why not give the private sector a carrot too in trying to, that you spend your own CSR funds to make your own institution accessible. Right. So a lot can be done, but...
Yeah, Shazia, let me ask you a follow-up question on this also, because, you know, a lot of what we're talking about right now on this panel, the issue of mobility and the ease of mobility for persons who are challenged, that Nipun is talking about, or training and giving skill training to people who have the cognitive powers to actually take on those skills. These are the easier, in the scheme of the topic we're talking about, these are the easier challenges perhaps to meet. You've worked with the Spastic Society, you said. There is a whole host of people in the differently abled universe who need much more than just skill training and much more than mobility and access, but institutional reform and institutional support from the government, from the private sector, who perhaps can't be as easily brought into the mainstream as the kind of people Nipun and Prashant are talking about.
No, true. I think access is a huge problem, and you just talked about the government buildings, and very few of them actually all over India, you know, and looking at this just as a secretariat, but important buildings, they don't have access. Look at our public spaces. Even if you want to, there are certain parks which are so, which have stairs, there are gates which are not accessible by wheels. Yeah. So it's very, very unfair. I really think, which is why a citizen intervention is needed. You know, because unless and until we raise these issues, it'll never ever be done. Look at cinemas, there are very few cinemas actually. So when you exclude people, this is an invisible minority, not such a small number also. They become invisible because they're not part of it. You say, why do you keep it hidden? Why they are kept? Because there's no way of getting out. How can, I have seen parents actually carry their children, you know, with difficulty because some of them can't afford help or have attendance. So it's actually, and you want to talk about dignity, that's part of the national policy. So how can dignity be possible if there's no access? So access remains a huge thing. But I still feel that government should do and must do, and every government, every state government is responsible. But also we as people in our RWAs, in the public spaces that we are part of, we should raise these questions.
Right.
We all have friends in different economic spectrums and people who work with us who have somebody in the family who's disabled. Do we inquire? Do we want to meet them?
That's an interesting point. And Nipun, I want you to come in on this. In your experience, is it the case that people who are doing things and changing attitudes are doing so because they've had some personal experience with a family member or a child, a sibling, as the case may be, who have decided that yes, things do need to change and things do need to be done. The other issue that Shazia mentioned just now was the issue of dignity, and I talked about respect a little while ago as well. The depiction of people who are differently abled in popular culture, your views on that, how does that need to change?
I think, unfortunately, it starts from the top of the depiction of culture, people with disabilities in popular culture, where your Prime Minister calls you Divyang or a divine soul, as Divyang is called. I guess it would be very difficult for me to go to a bar now and order a drink, because divine people, I guess, are not allowed to order a drink. But I think what's needed...
You can call it Somras.
But I think what's needed is that for the society to realize that people with disabilities are perfectly grey characters.
Yeah.
With their own interests, their own likes. They can be good, they can be bad, they can cheat people, they can help people, but they're complete individuals and they do not really require sympathy, but what they instead require is empathy. Often when I go to a market, something people start pushing my wheelchair around. I feel like telling them that I'm not a merry-go-round that you need to start pushing my wheelchair around.
I'll manage, thank you. Yeah.
So, you know, maybe they're trying to help, but at instances it can really seem offensive also. The terminology itself is of course very bad. Other than disability, other than Divyang, there's another very often used term called differently abled. And what I like to tell people is that everybody is differently abled and has some characteristic of the other. So I think it's just important to realize that people with disabilities are normal human beings. They just have a certain constraint. And let me describe what's really happened in the Western world. In the Western world, actually, the way disability is looked at has changed. It's moved from a medical problem where disability is looked at as an individual level, whether a person has articular forces like me, autism, etc., to a social model. And the social model basically means that it's the barriers that exist in society, whether in attitudes, law, or infrastructure that are the
divide. Yeah.
So I think India needs to move towards a social model too, and that's what.
Right. Shazia, wanted to come in?
I mean, we are supposedly a social welfare states, and you see social welfare states all over. What they've done, especially in Europe, if you see what their disability centers, maybe ours is a different country, they have huge numbers we're looking at. But the point that I want to make is what Pradeep ji and I would do is, he had rheumatic arthritis, and so he had a great problem getting out of his car every time, and you know, he needed his crutches. He was constantly looked at, stared at. We had a weekly ritual of going to a restaurant. He liked a particular Chinese restaurant. And everybody just either stared at him or was overtly nice to him. And he just said, I just want normalcy. So I would fight with him and it was just normal, and I would hit him and he'd play back, and you know, it was banter. And I think that's very important because people in trying to be nice. So I think it's just acceptance of the other. And it's whole thing of oneness that we need to work towards. The person might be physically looking different, could be challenged in a different way, but then each one of us are. And I think because they've been invisible, they've been out of sight for so long for us, that suddenly when we see them, we want to be overtly nice, and we don't know how to react. So we really need to work on this.
Right.
And
identify
normalize
the
it.
kind of talents or skills that would be possible to hone in them, whether it is service, whether it is music. I mean, some of the finest composers in the world have had you know, some hearing impairment or speech impairment, as the case may be. I want to open
and
this
even
up.
in pedagogy, the new systems that are coming in all over the world. There's fantastic research. There's all that is. We need to bring that in. And the only work you said is being done by parents of
in
families.
fact, some of the greatest initiatives are done by people who have a child or a member in their home. I want to open this up to the audience as well. We have three very interesting panelists, and I'm sure you have tons of questions for them. So, does anyone want to? Anyone have a? Yeah, go ahead, sir. Can we get a microphone too? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kunal Soni. My question is to Shazia. You know, you mentioning about the no parks being available for disabled people. The problem, I mean, you know, I don't see it happening for the next 5 or 10 years as well, because the problem is, suppose you open it for wheels, people with scooters will come in. You know, they'll just cross the road, they'll you know, bypass the traffic and they'll start coming in. How do you stop that? I mean, how do you make sure that that doesn't happen? Because you want to help people with disabilities, but then the other people, normal people, will take advantage and, you know, just use it for their convenience.
See, that's why what happens is, when we think of a law, then next thing we talk about is lack of enforcement and how to enforce, right? Which is exactly what you're saying. So you can make it a great law. How will you enforce it? You'll need somebody to enforce it. Those who are enforcing it might not want to enforce it, or might not be there, or if they are there, will misuse it. It happens. We've seen it happen in every state. And this is beyond parties. Let's not get politics into it, because this is who we are. So I think that's why it's very important that we are responsible. You know, when there is, even where, if you look at public transport, when there is actually a seat for the disabled person, sometimes there are for women, that is misused. So I think we as a country also should look at, we should look at ourselves as who we are as a people. So,
Can I also?
Yeah, you must.
Sorry, you can complete one.
So yeah, so it's a very important point you're making, which is why I keep coming back to it. You can have a great law, you can even look at enforcing it, but you cannot stop some odd person misusing it
anytime. We need to change our
anytime.
own attitudes.
Parking
I think
spots,
that's what it is.
parking spots. Do you know the kind of politics that is done when they're parking spots? And I'm talking about some corporates where I've worked.
I'm a victim, parking
Yeah.
spots.
So parking spots, you know, so it's this whole pettiness that comes with what can I get? I think we're a huge country. We've been jostling for space for ourselves. So it is there. So we sometimes forget that we need to refine ourselves. Be generous, especially towards those who might have a problem in accessing something. But we are petty about that as well, you know.
Nipun, you wanted to comment on this question?
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree with Shazia Ilmi. And if somebody really wants to break a law, they'll break a law anyway. During the odd even also, there are many people who are putting up fake CNG stickers to get exempted. But I don't think that should stop a policymaker from creating a good law. And I think it's up to you and me to maybe wait in a queue, make sure bikes do not enter a park, etc. It's up to the citizenry. Each one of us, if we follow the law will be respected. There are countries in the world that are following the law, and that's why they are ahead of India today. So,
Prashant, you wanted to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what they've just said. A misuse of a law cannot be the reason for not putting it in. So if we do that, then we'll not be able to make laws at all.
And I think that's the point that all our panelists have been making, is fundamentally the difference between sympathy and empathy. We as citizens need to be more conscious of our own fraternity. I mean, just a fellow human being. It doesn't matter what they look like, what they're using, whether they have a crutch or a wheelchair or have two perfectly normal legs. I think that's really something that we have to ask ourselves. And I also actually agree with Shazia. Whenever there is an issue, whenever there is an incentive or a suggestion that's made to improve or change something, the first response to it is, but how will it be implemented? And I think that's a secondary step. Let's put it into place first and then worry about the implementation. We'll find a way. We're a Jogadu nation, right? So we'll find a way. Any other questions? Okay, all right. While you all think of your questions, I'm going to come back to... Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead. I didn't see your hand.
Thank you. My name is Jay, and my question is for Shazia ji. Now, the question is that, you know, a government is elected to create policy, not to wax eloquent about how things cannot be done. Or, you know, the excellent question that Maya asked about creating institutional reform or bringing in statutory change. Now, the question is directly to you. What is your government doing to improve the situation of the disabled in India? I mean, there's a lot of sympathy we've heard even from you today.
Yeah, I know it's very...
So where are the answers?
Yeah, it's very, very fashionable to get up there and ask these questions, and I wear many hats, and I speak more as somebody who works on social advocacy on this issue. I don't work on you know, skill development in this particular issue. I work on a different area. So government has, there is a national action policy on skill development and other, which is 2006. In 2011, I think there was a bill, which is still in the standing committee, right? Am I right on that, Nipun?
yeah, but
So they're looking at that. The National Action Plan in skill development is where actual work is happening, where they're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, increasing, I think it's 2 lakhs, is going up to 10 in the next 7 years, to provide employment to persons with disability. So that's what they're looking at. And they're targeting rural populations also. And for that, state governments as well as the national government, there's a policy, and then it's done through the state governments. So if you read more as to how the implementation happens of every scheme, you will know that states and government are doing. How well they're doing, how badly they're doing is something you can keep arguing about. So it is in place. Something is happening there, but I think a lot more needs to be done.
But I think if I can just intervene, I think the point Nipun was raising earlier as well is that the discourse needs to change even at the level of the
Yes,
Prime
of
Minister.
course.
If he's imbuing divinity into people who are differently able, then we have a problem right at the top, because there is a
Absolutely.
sense of keeping them separate. Oh, you know, they're godly, so we must look after them differently.
No, the, nomenclature is one thing, you know, because Pradeep ji, what he used to tell me, he had a big problem with the word being called disabled. He says, you're taking away my ability away by calling me disabled. So nomenclature is a huge thing, and notwithstanding. But I think as a politician, as a bureaucrat, as a housewife, as a doctor, engineer, as a regular citizen, we need to change. So, and I think there has to be intervention also at the policy level.
Nipun,
which
as
has
an
been done.
activist, are you happy at all with the way policy is being implemented or addressed as far as these issues are concerned?
No, if you look at the three big newses in the disability sector last year, one of them was that Ira Singhal was appointed as a brand ambassador of the Accessible India campaign because she got the first rank in the civil services. What people do not know is that in 2010 she cracked the civil services too, but the medical board had not allowed her a posting saying that a person with a disability is not fit enough to become a district magistrate. She had to prove it by topping the civil services, and I think that is a shame. Another big news in the disability, from the government in terms of disability, was that Arunima Sinha was received a Padma Shri because she climbed Mount Everest, and she's the first female amputee to climb Mount Everest. But what most people here would not know is that the Paralympic Committee of India has been banned by the International Paralympic Association because of too much politics in it and the way it's one professionally run. Another issue was that there was this person with a 95% disability called Banti Dada, who was very congratulated with the government. The government gave him a job at Sector 2 because he'd completed a PhD from JNU despite his hardships. But every year, seats in Delhi University for people with disabilities open, and out of 1,300 seats, not more than 600 really get filled. So I think this government, previous governments have got into the habit of looking at people with disabilities as an inspirational porn, as I like to use the word, where they target a few individuals and celebrate their victories rather than creating big change on ground. I mean, just because I'm living a normal life should not be celebrated because I have to go through those hardships to lead that normal life. But in fact, the government should make it easier for a person like me to lead a normal life. And I don't think I've got any assurance from the representative of the government sitting here on whether the disability bill will be passed and converted into law. So,
but you do have divinity.
Sorry?
I said, but you do have divinity. You may not have an assurance,
Of
but
course.
you have divinity. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Any questions? Yeah. Lady right in front. We'll get you a microphone, ma'am, just a moment.
It's not like a question, but I just want to add that I think somewhere the whole process of inclusion must begin way down in schools. The quality of behavior of people by and large is educative on the other side, not on the side of people who have these select abilities. So acceptance of the same, how do we deal with pedagogy differently for different people? How do we look at the sports field and say, okay, now these people cannot be on the sports field, rather than saying, if somebody like Arunima can climb the Mount Everest, it puts two-legged people to shame. So I mean, some of the indicators have to be taken from people who have achieved all this, and then the entire reform and the ability of the schooling systems in this country, where how to deal with people with select abilities must be institutionalized. What is happening is there are institutions which are doing now more than ever before. There is this whole reformist act which is happening. It is not just in policies. And even beyond policies, people are doing things to change the systems. But I think it has to be a little more institutionalized. And how can the state and the country, and at the national and at the state levels, actually come together to make this institutionalizing happen in a more broader way?
And I think
then we will stop talking about them being very special.
Right,
They
and
should
that
be
brings us
treated
back
like
to the original issue, which is that you need some level of intervention or interference from the top to ensure that, you know, these are the guidelines. If you are a company that's setting up, you know, that you have to have your NOCs in place, if you have wheelchair access, if you have ramps, if you have elevators, if you have a certain percentage of your staff that you employ with a particular ability or skill. as the case may be. But these guidelines, if they come from the top, then perhaps you'll see some implementation. Everyone isn't, Prashant, who will, out of the goodness of his heart and purpose to society, do something like this, clearly, right, Nipun?
Sorry, just allow me to come in.
Yeah.
The point I was trying to drive is that even in our admission policies, we do talk of saying this much percentage.
Right.
Right? I'm trying to say, what about those that will get left out of this percentage? As if it's some kind of an accountability, we say, okay, 2% done, 12% done, whatever percentage done. But there's a whole segment of people who are out there who are not in the system at all.
So what do we
That
do
is
about
the
them?
issue. Yeah,
So
what do we do about them?
Shazia, because we're making the point of guidelines and implementation. So, okay, fine, you've met that 10%, 20% criteria. What about the remaining?
So while it is mandatory for schools, even private schools, also which have been there on government land and even otherwise, to have a certain percentage. Even in hospitals, as you know, there is something, and there is the thing prioritization for also economically weaker sections where schools are concerned, and also for the children with disability. But even if the policy is there, many schools cut corners. So all that is there. So it goes on across the board.
Right.
So the policy can be there, it has to be implemented. Private citizens, private trusts who run the schools have to be responsible for it, and as well as public servants. I see the consultations on the skill development where the policy National Action Plan for Skill Development is concerned. There was a brilliant consultative process where very senior people who have been experts have presented. So it's very well put across. Why I'm not tom-tomming it, because I don't want to just be a spokesperson for a party. I've done a little bit more than be in politics, that's the smallest bit I've done, is make sure that the consultations are right, the intervention is there, and then implementation happens. And then there is an actual dissemination of information in a way that affects mindsets, social prejudices that are there in all of us. You can have a bill in place, you can have increased employability or working on equal opportunities, and when the social attitudes won't change, and we will not change, and the RWAs will have a certain policy of comments to make, where do we go from there?
I think, ma'am, the question actually that you have raised is one that doesn't have an easy answer, because we're looking at trying to create some system that will include at least a percentage of this population. And I'm ashamed to actually accept and admit that there is no answer to your question.
Can I just indirectly answer that
Yeah,
question?
go ahead, Nipun.
I think one of the biggest problems in India also is that there's not enough research that is done on disability. The session before ours was on building an Indian Ivy League, and there were representatives from ISB, Ashoka University, etc. But India actually doesn't have a single university or college, whether private or public, that has a chair for disability or a department of disability studies that is actually researching and looking at the best practices globally that can be implemented in India. And I hope some of the panelists are here and they could hear this and implement such stuff in their colleges. Because if you notice in America this time, it'll help politics too, because you've noticed in America this time, Bernie Sanders is one of the presidential candidates, and his stump speech actually includes disability. And one of the reasons for that is because universities in America and the research they've done have helped pressurize him to include disability as an electoral thing. So if universities start studying disability, researching disability, such kind of policies and procedures will come into place. Politicians will realize the benefits of looking at disability. There'll be more pressure.
So it's a question of creating pressure from below as well to ensure that there is some change from the top, whether it's at government, whether it's the top of institutions. And if any of our previous panelists are sitting here, all you prospective Ivy League foundations, think about what Nipun has said. I think it's extremely important. We have just about 2 minutes left, but Prashant, last words.
Hello.
Yeah.
Well, I feel that India right now is the land of startups. And like you heard about the attrition in our company. The other qualities that we found in these boys and girls is commitment and focus. So if any startup can employ them as their core resource, you get commitment, you get focus, you get a lower attrition rate, which is the highest, which is the biggest drain on any company's resources. Then I think policy can change whenever it will, but from the ground level on. My restaurant is just across the road from IIT Bombay. And so many startups start from there, and they start with a very small strength. So whenever someone from IIT comes over and I'm talking to them, this is what I suggest. So I think it can work the other way as well. It's actually easier than it seems to. And only in hindsight do you realize, oh, this happened. But it's actually quite easy. So I think that's also a way.
I think that's a great note to end this discussion on, because it's a question of changing our own mindsets. It's really not as difficult as we think it may be. And I think Prashant's lesson is something we all should take inspiration from. All of you in your companies, think about what has been said on this panel and look at opportunities where a person who merits that, no matter what their physical condition may be, certainly, will be able to come into that role. And I think that's something everyone needs to think about. But the change, not necessarily top-down. In fact, let's not wait for top-down change. Let's just do it ourselves in our own ways whenever we can. Thank you all.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I would request Mr. Akshay Munjal from BML Munjal University to kindly grace the stage and present mementos to our esteemed panelists. First and foremost, Mr. Nipun Malhotra.
How are you? Especially came for your speech. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Up next, Ms. Shazia Ilmi. Ms. Maya Mirchandani. Can we have a round of applause, please? And Mr. Prashant Issar. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That was very insightful. Please give us a moment so that we can set up for the next session.